So yeah, super excited to have our first community event. Bit of an introduction. I am Natalie, the global marketing lead at Wild.AI. And we are here with Dr. Sian Allen, who is a research manager in the product innovation team at Lululemon, and has spent all of her time providing sport science support to athletes and coaches. But I don't want to steal your thunder. I'd love for you to tell us really exactly what it is that you do, and yeah, a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here in such an awesome community. I guess for me, I started out as an athlete myself a very long time ago. I played a lot of football, so soccer. I played in the English Women's Premier League, and then I sort of realized it wasn't at the stage where anyone was going to be professional like 10 to 15 years ago. So I was like, I guess I need to go and find myself another career. I'll try sports science and give that a go. So I went to university to study that, and then I did my master's in exercise physiology, and then I started working with elite athletes, working towards the Olympics and Paralympics most of the time in the UK. And then I moved to New Zealand to do my PhD over there, where I was looking again at athlete physiological training and testing data, and also data analytics as well. And I was there for about 6 years. And then I started to see in a lot of what I was doing, I was thinking this could be really useful for people who aren't elite athletes as well. And what if I could move somewhere where I could help make that possible and help make some of those things more accessible for people? And that was what prompted me to move to Lululemon in Canada. So if anyone isn't familiar with the brand, it's a clothing company. They do sports apparel, kind of active wear, but also very much in the like yoga, meditation, exercise, health and fitness space. So for the last 4.5 years, I've been working there, looking at ways we can use technology to make those healthy habits and practices more accessible to people at all different stages and phases of their life.
You mentioned that you played football or soccer. What is your kind of workout of choice, sport of choice now?
I sort of started doing a bit of everything, like running, swimming, cycling, weightlifting. And then I realized that CrossFit was just kind of like an accumulation of all of those things. And it was really fun because I got to do it with a bunch of people. So I started doing a lot of CrossFit, weightlifting, kind of interval HIIT sort of training. So that's mainly what I've been doing for the past 3 to 4 years.
Awesome. That sounds cool. Yeah, CrossFit is really fun. It's very much an amalgamation of everything. So yeah, the title of this chat is making wearables work better for women. So I don't know if you know, but 6% of medical science or sport research includes females. So that means that essentially all the wearables and apps that we're using really are made by men for men. So super excited to talk about this with you. But yeah, let's just kind of jump in. How did you become interested in testing wearables?
Yeah, it's really interesting because before wearables existed, a lot of the job that I had as a physiologist or a sports scientist was collecting these variables manually from athletes. So taking blood samples to measure their glucose, for example, measuring their heart rate variability in the morning, using questionnaires to measure sleep, those kinds of things. So I was doing a lot of that towards the beginning of my career, and then spending time trying to make sense of it. And what wearables did was really made that accessible for people and so much quicker for people. And so I started to see something that had previously only been in sports science just become accessible to everyone, which is amazing. But there was also this kind of huge education gap oftentimes that goes with it, where because athletes often have a scientist or a coach to help them make sense of it. But now this information is out in the wild, literally with people, and the devices and the apps, as good as they are, and they're getting better all the time, they don't always have the exact context for individuals. Oftentimes, as you sort of pointed out, many of the algorithms are trained on a specific set of people, like white males aged 20 to 35 from North America. And, that really isn't applicable to many people. So people have these tools at their disposal, but not necessarily the smarts or the help to interpret it the right way. And I started to see that in some of my friend groups. People were making crazy decisions based on things that they'd seen their wearable give them. Like they might have a readiness score or a recovery score from Aura or Woop, and they're like, oh, I'm going to stay in bed all day so I can get it to 100, or I'm going to train really hard so I can get my strain score to 21. And it's like, oh, hang on a minute, like I don't think that's what it's meant for. And there's just this huge kind of education gap that I was seeing that I think really still people need a lot of help on an individual level to help figure out what's the right thing for them, especially if you're from like a very different demographic to who the algorithms are trained on.
Yeah. So how have you, I guess it's an interest of yours, how have you been addressing that with your testing?
Yeah, so I mean, I had tried a bunch of these different devices from personal curiosity, from the point of view of my job, thinking about which devices are useful to use for scientific research or in the field with athletes and those kinds of things. And so some of the testing that I did was to wear a lot of these devices at the same time and to compare the data that I was getting. And I've sort of gone through that from a data analytics perspective, plotted lots of variables and looked at it against the context that I have in terms of how did I feel this today? How did I do in training? How sore was I? When do these numbers make sense? When do they not? And what I tried to do is document that and share it back for people on Twitter to sort of say, hey, these were my experiences. These were the things that I observed. Hopefully this is helpful for you as you're trying to figure it out for yourself, but also to potentially encourage people to do the same thing. Like, what does it look like for you to figure out what works best for you? And maybe these are some ways you can do it. Like, try wearing a few of these things at once if you can, or if you're wearing one thing, see what it looks like every day to sort of ask yourself how you feel before you open the app and see how close it is, see what the difference is, see if you can just start to understand yourself a little bit better, like through that process.
Yeah. So what you actually did from what I read on your Twitter thread is that you actually tracked kind of pre-conception, conception, as well as through your pregnancy, and you utilized 3 different wearables. Can you walk us through, I guess, that process? What made you do that, and I guess what your findings were, and kind of a bit of a summary on the thread itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So it just happened that I was doing this experiment at the time, wearing the 3 devices, and I ended up getting pregnant sort of halfway through. And so then retrospectively, or at the time, I was like looking at my data. So I was wearing the Apple Watch, I was wearing the Oura Ring, and I was wearing the Whoop wristband. And at the time, it was only Oura that had the body temperature sensor. And so as I looked at my data, there was a clear spike in my body temperature just a few days after conception, and it stayed high consistently. And I also saw from the other devices, I saw my resting heart rate go up, my heart rate variability go down, which are all signs that there's something going on. But in those variables that the other devices had, Whoop and Apple Watch, it wasn't completely clear that this was happening. It could have just been that, like, oh, I was training hard, which, I was kind of doing at the time. So it was a bit ambiguous. Whereas when I looked at my Oura data, it was absolutely clear from the temperature that was sustained that, yes, there was something going on. It kind of made sense that, this was when I'd conceived, and then it stayed high for about 10 weeks, which, is kind of an unmistakable pattern versus the other variables. And so that was really valuable for me to have that confirmation, because I didn't actually take the pregnancy test until about 8 weeks later. And so like that, it really gave me like a big head start on how I was able to kind of like manage my lifestyle and training and those kinds of things.
You mentioned a lot of kind of those key metrics that you were looking at, whether that's temperature, heart rate, etc. What do those measurements kind of mean in relation to you and your training?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think resting heart rate is normally one that you see a stronger correlation with your baseline aerobic fitness. So over time, that's something interesting to track to see if it's coming down, it's getting lower. That basically means your heart is almost getting stronger. You're adapting to the training that you're doing, versus heart rate variability that's more sensitive to acute stresses. So day to day, you might see that if you have a heavy training load, and you want to make more of those decisions around what should I do today, HRV is normally the more sensitive metric. But there's a lot to be careful with around it because it is affected by stress, or it can also be affected by life stress if you have things going on at work or family or those kinds of things. And so sometimes when you're using some of these apps and they're only taking in training load, they don't necessarily have the right context to interpret it. And they might say, oh, you didn't respond very well to training yesterday, but actually you just had a really bad day at work. And that's what's stressing you out. And so that's why it sometimes helps to like go a bit deeper and be a bit more curious about some of these numbers and think like, does this make sense? If not, like, what am I missing? And then trying to layer that in to make sense of what you should do that day, or what you should do kind of like long term as well.
It sounds like also you should be checking in with yourself as well, like understanding kind of what are the stresses or what are the things going on in your life that might also affect these different metrics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the really interesting things that I saw when I did compare some of the data that I was getting from Woop, one of the experiments that I did was, as I said before, I opened the app, I would take a moment to check in with myself and try and guess, what do I think my recovery score is today? Like if I had to put a percentage on it, what would it be? And so I did that for about 6 weeks, wrote it down, compared it to the Woop ones. And then when I look back at it, about 50% of the time it was similar. And the times it was different, there were almost two reasons. One of them was because I felt worse than we said I did. And I had a lot of like muscle soreness from training, which is really hard for like a product like Whoop to measure because it's looking at cardiovascular strain. It's not looking at muscular fatigue or damage and those kinds of things. And then the other one was when it was saying that I slept really well when I actually didn't. So that I felt like there were some inaccuracies in the data. And so like that process really just helped me to kind of get in tune with like what to trust a bit more, when to trust myself, what to pay attention to, what questions to ask to kind of feel like I was on the right track. So I was using the data as a bit of a crutch, but also trying to build up that capacity in myself, that intuition, if you will, to say like, hey, like I can really trust myself to make some of these decisions, and try and grow that ability over time as well, so that you don't become completely reliant on technology that sometimes can fail or can like lead you down the wrong path.
Yeah. I mean, because 50% of the time, I feel like, I don't know, I'm surprised it should be more, right? You would think it'd be kind of more
Yeah,
aligned.
I mean, I think they're getting better all the time in terms of like factoring in some of these other variables. Like I see different apps and things now taking into account like, this is how sore I am, this is the life stress that was going on. And I think things will get better in that sense, but it's really hard to measure all of that context that you have. And as a sports scientist with an athlete, that's the kind of thing where you would say, hey, I'm seeing something in your data, should we have a conversation about it, like what's going on? And then in the richness of that like human conversation, it comes out. And so I think technology will get better at measuring those things. But right now, I would just encourage people to say, if something doesn't make sense, think about what else is going on in your life. Like, what would make this make sense? What is potentially missing and can fill in those gaps?
Yeah, definitely. Why did you choose the wearables that you used? Because I mean, there's many others. But why like Whoop, or Ring, and Apple Watch?
Yeah, I tried some of the other ones in the past as well, and I think they're potentially a slightly different demographic in terms of like Fitbit had been mostly people who are interested in step counts, and Garmin like they're really strong in activity measuring. And then there was quite a lot of hype around these variables when they came out, particularly in the athletic community. And what we saw was athletes who were in teams, they would just start picking up these devices themselves and playing with them. And you might have athletes who you're working with, one of them is using Aura, one of them's using Whoop, and they're all coming to you and like trying to compare things and say, what makes sense? What should I do? And as a scientist working in those situations, like you just want to have a handle on what it means and how to make sense of them. And so these were the ones that I saw people making those decisions around, in terms of like, yeah, I'm going to do this crazy training thing tomorrow to get my strain score up to 100. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, let's try and figure out what's going on with these so I can be in a position to give them some decent advice about how best to use them potentially.
And from the thread, you mentioned that you stopped using Whoop. Why was that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I saw some really strange data with my Whoop that may have just been very individual specific to me in terms of how I was wearing the device. Was I wearing it on a part of my wrist that was particularly bony? It didn't get a good signal. But as an example of one thing that I saw, I in the morning I did like an hour sort of weightlifting CrossFit class, and it was like a 9 out of 10 hard. I would have rated it, and I got a strain score that was fairly low. It was like a 9 out of 21. And then in the afternoon, I went for like a 1 hour easy walk around around the block, and it said my maximum heart rate was 184, and my strain score was 16 out of 21, and it was just really bizarre. And there were things like that that just made me question, like, this is the data stream that's underlying all of what they're presenting to you, so that's the underlying data that's informing the recovery score, the strain score. And I thought, if there are these inaccuracies with it, because it happened a few different times, it just made me really question the veracity of some of the other data that I was seeing. And so in the end, I just decided that I would stick to one device, or take Whoop off and stick with Aura, and then use different monitoring for my workout activities. So for that, I decided just to use like the polar chest strap, because that's the most accurate, albeit it's not like a wrist-based device. But it was really important to me to get more accurate data during exercise that I could also see, because I know with Whoop you can't actually see it in real time, but sometimes I would be monitoring my workouts, making sure I was in the right training zone, and I needed to be able to see it in real time. So I just made that decision because it was really important for me. But for other people, I know different things are more important. And I've also known people who've used Whoop and got really good data out of it. So I think there are some of those individual differences as well that makes it really important to test some of these things for yourself, and do what works for you.
Yeah. So what, I guess, are the pros and cons of all the ones that you use? But I guess we've talked a lot about Whoop, but Aura Ring, Apple Watch, even kind of chest strap. Yeah, what were the other pros and cons of each?
Yeah, I think one thing that I did find was there wasn't one device that did everything that I wanted it to do all in one. And so what I found Aura really useful for was the fact that it's pretty low friction and it's really easy to wear. I sort of forget that it's there. Once it's on, it's not troubling me when I'm trying to get to sleep, and it's getting like some decent data for sleep, heart rate variability during the night, and it's actually passive data as well. I don't have to do anything. And so I use it primarily for those things. And then the variable that I found really interesting with Aura was the body temperature, which again, I'd use for all sorts of things. Like it would be like a leading indicator of sickness, illness, potentially. When I got COVID, it was really obvious from my body temperature with Aura. And then it was really useful around like monthly cycle tracking as well, and also around the pregnancy side of things. And then I would find the Apple Watch really useful for measuring heart rate in workouts, because in most research studies, in terms of wrist-based and finger-based devices, the Apple Watch has been shown to be the most accurate, and I could also see the values in real time. So I found it useful for that, as well as using the polar chest strap as well that I mentioned.
So is that like the combination that you found that works? Are you continuing to kind of use those three?
I can't actually wear anything on my wrists right now because my son is 7 months old and he will grab anything and pull it off. So he doesn't actually do that with the Aura Ring, which is nice. So that's the only thing I can actually wear, which is kind of a very nuanced take on it that I've just learned as a new mother. But yeah, if I could still continue to wear a wristwatch, then the Apple Watch would probably be my choice in combination with Aura, but also with the polar chest strap for that higher fidelity data during workouts as well.
Interesting. And you talked about Aura Ring being able to tell temperature and being really helpful in that sense. There are a lot of women who track their ovulation through temperature. Do you kind of trust, specifically Aura, because you talked about temperature, to accurately measure that?
Yeah, I think it will depend quite a lot on how regular people's cycles are.
Mm-hmm.
And from the research that I've seen, when people have regular cycles, there's around 80 to 85% accuracy to detect ovulation within a window of, I think it's like 3 days either side. And I certainly was able to see that in my data. I could see sort of clear cycles. But then I think oftentimes when you come to think about athletic women, people don't necessarily always have the most regular cycles for whatever reason. I've certainly seen cases with athletes where it's not as clear. And, I think you have to be careful about some of those things. So this is kind of how I like to think about wearables in general, that you can maybe use them as a screening tool to collect data on yourself or from all sorts of people. And then you can look at it and say like, hey, is there anything that I should look at more deeply and kind of do something that's a bit more accurate, where I might want to do some hormonal measuring or those kinds of things, because I think there's something up here or something doesn't make sense. And it's really nice because it kind of gives people that like control and autonomy and the chance to like detect some of those things. But I don't think they're like clinical diagnostic tools right now where you can really say, oh yeah, you really have like a problem, you have this condition. It's just like a smoke signal where I would be like, okay, let's go deeper here. And it's great that it allows you to do that, but it's not like the be all and end all because of the level of accuracy that exists right now.
Yeah, fair. So using it with like incongruence with something else, or just, yeah, having that be a kind of a trigger to let you know that there are things happening to you to look.
Yeah, exactly. Like, hey, pay attention here.
Okay, exactly. Okay. And what did your training kind of look like before your pregnancy, kind of during as well as after? How did that change?
Yeah, so I was doing like probably like something every day. So I would do like CrossFit probably like 4 or 5 times a week, and then I do a lot of yoga, like running on some of the other days, just like eat easier, different kind of stuff. And so the biggest change really through pregnancy was I didn't change the frequency of training, but I did modify the intensity and some of the like modes of exercise that I was doing. So I sort of stopped cycling at a certain point just because I didn't want to crash into anyone or have anything like that happen. And I was still doing weightlifting, but just like I was really using the heart rate monitoring device that I was using to make sure like, oh, I'm not going above probably like 80% of my maximum heart rate. I made modifications to movements for what felt right, what worked for me, and also the weight that I was lifting as well. I dropped it down probably to like below like 70% of my kind of 1 rep max, and was just kind of lifting at something that was comfortable for me, but very like individualized and personal as well. Like someone else could have looked at it and said, whoa, that's really heavy, or that's really light, So I think it was really important for me to have had all of that data in advance and to sort of like checked in with myself and used it to know like this is right for me, because a lot of the advice that I got from the medical system was, oh, take it easy, just like go for a walk and sit on the couch and that kind of thing. And I was like, oh, hang on a minute, like I don't think that's not the best thing for me to do, knowing myself and kind of where I am. And so there really wasn't a lot of like official support available for that. So I had to try and figure it out by myself using my data and what was kind of available online, which wasn't a lot, to be honest.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I guess, what do you feel should have been in place since there was such a lack of, information or support? What would have been good to be there?
Yeah, I know there is more kind of research happening now, but one of the things that certainly using this wearable data, I was looking at some of my metrics and seeing, oh, my resting heart rate's gone up and my heart rate variability has gone down, but I don't know what normal is. Like, is it normal that these trends are happening? And there was just no data out there that I could find to almost like reassure me and give me that confidence that like, yes, this is normal, or no, like, hey, there's something up with this, you should pay more attention to it. And I think there is a lot of individual variability in that as well, but people are starting to collect these data, and I think there is things that you that can be done with it to almost like reassure people and help them figure out like these are normal trends at this phase of pregnancy, and this is potentially how you might manage training on top of it as well. Because if you are using some of those markers like heart rate variability and resting heart rate to adjust your training, because I was using like Aura and Woop, for example, and they didn't know that I was pregnant. They were saying to me all the time, oh, your readiness is really bad. You shouldn't do anything today. You should just take it easy. And I'm like, well, no, I feel okay. You're just seeing those data because I'm pregnant. And so then it was really hard to like take that advice and use it in a helpful way. I was having to figure out for myself, like, are these numbers poor just because I'm in this stage of pregnancy or because I'm actually tired? And, it was actually really helpful to do that kind of check in with myself every day, and having done it over a number of weeks and months to kind of get to the place where I was using that data to be able to know myself, but not everyone is in that position. And so access to some kind of like norms and like personalized sort of training advice, I think would be really helpful based on kind of the data that is starting to be more available now.
Yeah, sounds like, I mean, yeah, as you say, there are a lot more kind of other apps or things kind of helping women through pregnancy that might be able to give this information, but I think it's still there's still ways to go. Talking about kind of post pregnancy, kind of the recovery phase, because obviously your body goes through like a massive trauma, really. And it goes through so much, and there's obviously quite a bit of recovery that needs to happen. What are your tips for recovery and kind of post pregnancy?
Yeah, I wasn't that prepared for it, but with that comes you have to take 6 weeks of doing nothing, kind of no matter what happens. And that was the first time I've ever done that in my life. And so, like, I think mentally, kind of being okay with that and like letting go of any kind of expectations of like, oh, I should be doing something, or being okay with like just letting your body rest and recover and focus on other things. Like that was the biggest thing for me, and kind of just almost trusting that things will come back over time, but being patient. That was one of the hardest things because that was just completely new to me. So that was a really big one. And I think one of the other things I would say is just like sleep is such a big thing. Everyone talks about it, but I was trying to do everything I could to prioritize that as much as possible. So I would go to bed at 7 p.m. because that was the only way I was going to get like 7 or 8 hours of sleep at the beginning when my son was waking up all the time. And so it's like they were looking at those places where I could potentially like try and prioritize those foundations of recovery. And then as it got back to training, I was working with like a women's health physio, which was amazing. I would recommend it to anyone because you get objective data on things like how your pelvic floor health is recovering, how you're able to move properly. Like she was using an ultrasound, and I like, when you do those pelvic floor exercises and you're like, am I doing it right? I'm not sure. She was able to say like, yes, this is how you're doing it right. When it feels like this, you're doing it right. And that was a real game changer for me. And one of the other things she did for me was we worked on this like traffic light system when I was introducing new movements. Green was like symptom free, feels good, like absolutely fine. Orange was like there's like some minor symptoms, like there's a bit of heaviness, tightness, maybe a bit of like leakage or bleeding, that kind of thing, but you're able to do the movement, it feels okay, it looks good. And then red was like, oh, some serious symptoms, like you want to stop the movement there and then. And the thing she was saying to me that was really helpful was you shouldn't stop as soon as you have like minor symptoms. And a lot of people do because they get nervous and they get scared, but you actually want to be in that zone because that's like the overload zone. That's how you're going to improve and start to get back some of your fitness. And so you have to be really careful in paying attention to what's going on, but don't be afraid to like push it a little bit. And that will actually really help you recover. And so that really reassured me a lot as well, because again, it's a very new thing for me. And when like I'm doing air squats and I have like bleeding going on, I'm like, oh, hang on a minute, this really isn't right. And she's like, no, it's okay if it's manageable and you feel good. Just like take a bit of a break, take a few days off, and then kind of come back to it. And what I found was that was really helpful, and I was able to over time sort of overcome those symptoms and probably get some of my health and fitness and strength back more quickly than I would have just by stopping and kind of like waiting for everything to be perfect all the time.
Yeah. Do you think that's also a good system for people who might be recovering from like injuries as well? And
yeah, absolutely. Because I think it works on like a lot of the principles of training physiology are around like progression and overload. Like you need a bit of that stimulus for your body to adapt, but you obviously don't want to push it too far. And that's where it can be helpful to use data that you have during workouts or how you're feeling day to day to say like, yeah, I want to push it a little bit and keep myself progressing. but I don't want to do too much. So it's like knowing where those limits are, and the better you can know yourself and using data to help you to do that, I think it just kind of equips you to do that really powerfully, because you don't always have a physio or a scientist or someone on hand all the time. But data and technology can be really helpful for that too.
Yeah. Cool. Closing things up a little bit, but like, what were the key outcomes of your findings kind of with the like wearables? And I guess what has been your favorite that you've used kind of throughout?
I think some of the key findings were that experiences are very different for different people. And it's really important for you to find what works for you, what gives you data that makes sense, is actually actionable, and you feel is accurate to your experiences. And then also that you don't have to use every number that's given to you. You
Yeah.
can use bits and pieces of it that you find useful, but it's also really beneficial to supplement that with your unique context. There are lots of things that these apps are great for, but things that they don't know about you as well, that if you can find ways to sort of combine them and help figure out what works for you, I think the best thing is figuring out how to use the data technology to help you as a tool, but not to be like the be all and end all guide. It's like helping you trust yourself and hone your intuition a little bit more, because ultimately I think about this a lot. Like, you might be on the football pitch or in the middle of a triathlon, and you're just relying on yourself at that point in time. You have to know yourself in the middle of a race, like, hey, can I push the pace or not? You have to rely on those sensations, and these wearables can actually be a really good tool to help you get more in touch with yourself. And it's something that I've measured in athletes and folks in research studies, and it's called interoceptive accuracy. And interoception is basically like being able to feel your feelings and sensations, like how good are you at that. And so an example might be feeling like a tightness or that kind of like strained sensation maybe in your tummy. And for some people that's hunger, for some people that's anxiety, because you have those like butterflies or nervousness. And so if you pay attention to those sensations and you can really figure out like, hey, this is how I feel in these moments, and you're more attuned to yourself, I think checking in with data every day can just help you go through that reflective process to help you know yourself better. And so I would use it like that as a tool, not necessarily as like, oh my God, my recovery score is 0, I really should just do nothing today. It's like, does it make sense for you? What's it missing? And then how can you make it useful? How will you sort of change what you're doing and over time track what you're doing to help you better know yourself?
Right. So your readiness score is not your be all and end all. It's just kind of an informative thing that you
Yeah,
might be.
I think it's something where I'd say like use it, be curious about it, ask why, be a bit skeptical as well if something doesn't make sense. There's a reason for that. Maybe it's missing some of your context. Maybe it's not completely accurate that day, but just be open-minded and be curious, and yeah, like try some of these things out, figure out what works for you and what doesn't, and that's different for different people, and that's kind of okay. It's also part of the fun.
Yeah, definitely. And then lastly, what advice would you give to women training through pregnancy and recovery?
Yeah, I think I would say the better you can get to know yourself and your body and how it responds before pregnancy, during, just paying attention to what's going on, the more data you can use to supplement that, the better. And then people's experiences are very different. For some people, they really do need to, rest as much as possible, and they may have things going on where they really need that like medical advice to be really strong. And then for other people, I think it's the thing that I would probably share is there is a massive range of those experiences, and it can be completely okay for you to train in the gym, lifting heavy weights or running pretty fast. It's all what's relative to you, what's normal, what feels good for you. And you see a lot of people making judgments about some of those things without any of the context behind it. And I think it's like, just don't like, it's okay to do what's right for you.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to do that. Like, just feel confident in what you're doing while you're continuing to do it in a safe way. And I think there will be more research coming out all the time with more kind of data and recommendations that will start to be more helpful. But yeah, I think it's like just get to know yourself and then trust yourself to do what's right for you.
Cool. And will you continue to post on your Twitter threads about the data that you find as well?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I have a bunch of data just that's really interesting, just looking at like, hey, these are my actual trends through like pregnancy, through recovery, looking at how your heart rate and heart rate variability kind of rebounds. And then there's some really interesting things that I've seen as well, just from like body temperature, looking at like how your kind of cycle comes back or doesn't, like those kinds of things that I think are really interesting, because I just don't think like people have a lot of that information available. And so you're looking for like what's normal. And if I can share something that helps people in any way or feel curious about their own data, then yeah, I'll try and keep doing that as much as possible.
Yeah, awesome. Please do, because we love it. We love it. Cool. I don't know if anybody who is watching has any questions for Sean. But if not, yeah, thank you so much for joining. And it was really great chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is an awesome community, and yeah, if anyone has any questions or anything else, then I'm happy to answer them, sort of in the forum or on Twitter or anything like that.
Amazing. Well, thanks again.
Thank
Um,
you.
all right. Bye.